Rain clawed at the windows like a desperate hand, its relentless assault merging with the wind's howl as it tore through the prairie. The homestead groaned under the fury of the storm, its wooden beams shuddering like a body braced for blows. Inside, the air hung thick with sweat, smoke, and the metallic tang of fear. Sarah Jane's breath came in ragged bursts, her teeth clenched so tightly her jaw ached, but the scream lodged in her throat refused to escape. It was not the pain that silenced her. It was the knowledge that every shriek would be a signal to the shadows lurking beyond the lantern's flickering light. Her body arched backward, her spine bending as if trying to snap free from its own agony, her palms digging into the straw-stuffed mattress until her knuckles turned white. The midwife, Hannah Morse, moved like a ghost at her side, her hands steady despite the tremor in her voice. "Almost there, honey," Hannah murmured, her brow slick with sweat, her dark eyes darting toward the hearth where two figures loomed in silence. Sarah's mind replayed Agatha Crane's word from a week prior, sharp as a blade. "If she births girls again, we're done keeping her. We didn't take her in to feed beggars." The memory coiled around her ribs, tightening with each contraction. The room seemed to shrink, the shadows stretching longer, the lantern's glow shrinking under the weight of the hatred festering in the corners. Then a sudden, searing rip, pain so raw it felt like her body was tearing itself apart. A primal sound tore from her throat, muffled only by her own shoulder as the world blurred into a haze of fire and blackness. And then silence. A heartbeat of stillness before two shrill cries split the air, sharp and hungry, like the universe itself demanding life. Hannah's voice was barely a whisper, trembling with dread. Twins, two small bodies, slippery and red with life. Sarah's breath hitched, her chest freezing mid-inhale. "Girls!" The word echoed in her skull, a death knell and a lullaby intertwined. She reached out, trembling fingers brushing the swaddled bundles Hannah placed in her arms. Their warmth seeped into her skin, their tiny fists curling against her chest like promises. She named them silently. Rosie, Nora. But the names barely settled before the door creaked open, a gust of icy wind snuffing the lantern's flame. Agatha Crane stepped inside first, her shawl drawn tight like armor, her lips pressed into a thin line of venom. Behind her, Silas Crane lingered, his tall frame casting a jagged silhouette against the stormlight. Hannah stiffened, her hands hovering over the basin of bloody water, her gaze locked on Sarah with a silent plea. "Run." The room thickened with unspoken verdicts. Agatha's voice was cold as stone. "Well, what are they?" Hannah answered, though the truth was written in the squirming pink flesh in Sarah's arms. "Girls. Healthy." Silas exhaled a sound like a curse, his eyes narrowing as he studied Sarah. She felt it then, the calculation, the contempt, the unspoken pact between them to let her bleed out before dawn. The door shut behind them with a finality that shook the floorboards. Hannah wiped Sarah's brow with a cloth soaked in lukewarm water, her touch gentle but urgent. "They don't want you here, child," she whispered, her voice fraying. "You know that now." Sarah nodded, her throat raw. "I've always known," she rasped, "but now they don't want the girls either." Hannah's gaze flicked to the infants, then back to Sarah, her expression hardening. "You got strength in you more than most. But listen to me now. Don't let them catch you sleeping too deep. Not till you're out of this place." Sarah's fingers tightened around her daughter's, their breaths soft against her neck. Outside, the storm raged on, but the true tempest was the one brewing in the barn, where whispers of fire and lies already curled like smoke beneath the door. Silas's eyes lingered on the infants, sharp as a blade honed to slit throats. His jaw tightened, the muscle in his cheek twitching like a horse straining against reins. "Girls," he spat, the word venom, acidic enough to eat through the wooden floorboards. Sarah's arms locked around Rosie and Nora, their tiny hearts pounding against her ribs like trapped birds desperate to escape a snare. The air in the room thickened, sour with the stench of wet wool, sweat, and the unspoken verdict hanging over them. Agatha's lips pressed into a thin line, her knuckles white as she gripped her shawl. "Twins," she muttered, as if the word itself were a curse. "Two mouths to feed. Two girls will never swing a scythe or break a plow. Useless." Sarah's breath hitched, her body still trembling from childbirth, but her voice cut through the room like flint striking steel. "They're alive. Healthy. That's more than your son ever gave you." Silas stepped forward, his shadow swallowing her whole. "Careful, Sarah. You're in no position to remind us of what's ours." That night, as thunder rumbled like a distant drum roll for her funeral, Sarah lay awake, the twins curled against her chest. The cranes' voices slithered through the cracks in the cabin walls, carried by the wind. In the barn, Silas and his mother huddled over lantern light, their whispers sharp as splinters. "She'll bleed out by morning," Silas hissed, his voice low and certain. "The barn's dry as kindling. One spark and she's gone. The girls, too. Say the roof collapsed in a storm. No one will question it." Agatha's reply was quieter, but Sarah caught the edge of it. "Make sure Hannah doesn't meddle. She's soft-hearted, and softness gets people killed." Sarah didn't move, didn't even exhale until the voices faded and the lantern's glow winked out. Her mind raced. Hannah, the midwife who'd risked her own safety to deliver the twins, the only flicker of kindness in this house of thorns. If Hannah had overheard, if she dared. The door creaked open just before dawn. Sarah's hand flew to the knife she'd hidden beneath the mattress, her pulse roaring in her ears. But it was Hannah, her dark eyes wide with urgency. "Sarah," she whispered, slipping inside and pressing a bundle in her arms. A shawl, rough and scratchy, but thick enough to shield the babies from the cold. "Go east, toward the river. There's old trapping paths there. Someone might help." Sarah's throat tightened. "Why?" she rasped, her voice frayed with disbelief. Hannah's hands trembled as she fastened a shawl around the twins. "Because I've seen too many women buried under lies and firewood. Because you've got fight in you, and fight's worth something." Sarah didn't ask again. She kissed the girls' foreheads, slipped on her boots, and stepped into the storm. Mud sucked at her feet, each step a battle against the earth itself. The horizon was swallowed by smoke. Silas hadn't waited. The shed where she'd once fetched water, where Hannah had built the cradle from an old drawer, was already ablaze, flames licking the sky like a taunt. Had Hannah's kindness bought her 5 more minutes of life? Sarah didn't know. She only ran, her body screaming with the ache of torn flesh and exhaustion, the twins whimpering against her chest. Behind her, the fire crackled, a hungry beast gnawing at the past. Ahead, the prairie stretched endless, cruel, and filled with teeth. But the girls breathed against her, and that kept her moving. Somewhere around dawn, her legs gave out. She fell to her knees near the edge of a creek swollen with rain, the girls' cries piercing the silence. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "If someone's out there, if anyone's left kind, please." The clouds broke just enough for a shaft of pale light to fall across the clearing, and through it came the sound of hooves. Not thunderous, not fast, just steady. A horse and a rider. Sarah tried to lift her head, but her vision blurred. She saw a silhouette, wide-shouldered, still as a tree. The man didn't move for a long while. Then he dismounted slowly and knelt beside her. He didn't ask her name. He didn't need to. He lifted them all, mother, daughters, into his arms, strong but careful. She pressed her face to his chest, the beat of his heart a fragile anchor, and let the dark take her. Back at the Crane house, no one noticed the cradle was empty until the sun rose. By then the tracks were washed away, and on a quiet hill miles away, the widower built up the fire in his cabin and laid 3 blankets near the hearth. He didn't know her name yet, but he would in time. The storm had not broken, but something else had. an old, bitter silence in the man's soul. He looked down at the sleeping woman and her girls and thought, maybe this is how something begins. Not with thunder, but with breath. Dawn bled through the trees in pale, fractured streaks, the light thin and brittle like ice cracking underfoot. Sarah's legs gave out near the edge of a creek swollen with rain, her knees sinking into the mud with a wet squelch. Her body felt like a map of cracks, muscles torn from childbirth, bones hollowed by exhaustion, skin numb where the cold gnawed at it like a feral thing. The twins whimpered in her arms, their breath shallow and uneven, their tiny fists curling against her soaked shawl. Every part of her screamed to collapse, to let the earth swallow her whole. But the baby's cries anchored her. Not yet. She begged silently, her teeth chattering. Not yet. Then, through the haze of her fraying thoughts, the sound of hooves. Not thunderous, not fast, but steady, a rhythm that cut through the silence like a heartbeat. Sarah's head jerked up, her vision blurring as she scanned the tree line. A silhouette emerged, broad-shouldered and still, his shape outlined against the gray dawn. The horse behind him snorted, steam curling from its nostrils, but the man didn't move. He stood like a tree rooted in place, his posture neither threatening nor welcoming, just present. Sarah's throat tightened. She reached for the knife hidden in her bodice, her fingers trembling so badly she nearly dropped it. "You lost." His voice was gravel, roughened by years of disuse, but there was no malice in it, only a quiet, weathered curiosity. He stepped closer, slow enough that she could see the details. A rifle slung across his back, a beard streaked with gray, eyes the color of storm clouds, unreadable and deep. One of the twins stirred, a tiny hand slipping free of the shawl to reach toward him. The baby's fingers brushed his calloused thumb, and something in the man's face shifted, a flicker of surprise, maybe a recognition. He crouched without a word, his knees popping like dry twigs, and looked at the girls for a long time. The wind carried the scent of pine and leather off his coat, sharp and clean, a stark contrast to the stench of smoke still clinging to Sarah's clothes. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, almost to himself. "Well, ain't you all just clinging to life?" He lifted them, mother and daughters, as if they were made of light, his arms sliding beneath Sarah's shoulders and the cradle of her arms with a strength that belied his weariness. The motion jostled the babies, but they didn't cry. Instead, Rosie pressed her cheek to his chest, her tiny fingers snagging on the frayed edge of his sleeve. Sarah wanted to ask his name, to demand where he was taking them, but her tongue felt too heavy. The world tilted as he mounted the horse, settling her in front of him with the care of someone used to handling fragile things. She pressed her face to his coat, the fabric scratchy against her cheek, and inhaled the faint warmth of wood smoke and iron. The horse moved, its hooves crunching through frost-bitten grass, and the trees blurred into a green-brown haze. Somewhere behind her, the creek gurgled, indifferent. Ahead, the prairie stretched endless, the sky bleeding into the horizon. Who was this man who carried strangers like ghosts? Sarah wondered dimly, her eyelids drooping. Not a savior. There was no holiness in his posture, no grandeur in the way he rode. But there was something else, something quieter, a man who knew how to hold space for broken things, who moved through the world without expectation. The wind carried his scent to her again, pine, leather, and something else, faint but familiar. Grief. It clung to him like the cold, but it didn't drown him. He carried it the way he carried her, steady, without complaint, as if he'd long since made peace with its weight. The horse's rhythm lulled her, the ache in her body dulling to a throb. She tightened her grip on the babies, their warmth seeping in her chest, and let the dark take her. Behind her, the man guided the horse with one hand, the other hovering near her shoulder, ready to steady her if she slipped. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The tracks they left would be washed away by dusk, and by then, the cabin would be waiting, a hollowed-out sanctuary tucked into the hills, its fire already burning. Not for her, not yet, but for whoever needed it most. The cabin smelled of pine and ash, its silence broken only by the twins' muffled cries, a fragile, rhythmic counterpoint to the crackle of the fire. The air was thick with the scent of resin and smoke, mingling with the faint metallic tang of old grief that lingered in the corners. Micah Holt moved like a shadow, his boots silent on the creaking floorboards as he stoked the hearth, feeding the flames with precise, deliberate motions. He stirred the stew hanging over the fire with the same quiet efficiency, the wooden spoon scraping the iron pot in a rhythm that felt almost ritualistic. Sarah watched him from the cot, her spine rigid, her hands clenched around the edge of the blanket. Her muscles were coiled for flight, even as exhaustion pulled at her bones. The babies whimpered again, their tiny fists curling against their swaddled bodies, and Micah paused mid-stir to glance at them. His face betrayed nothing, but his eyes softened, a flicker of warmth behind the storm clouds. He handed her a tin cup of water without a word, the metal cool against her trembling fingers. She drank slowly, her throat raw from the night's terror, and watched as he crossed to the door. He checked the latch twice, his calloused hand lingering on the iron handle, as if reassuring himself of its strength. Then he moved to the corner, where his rifle leaned against the wall, and began disassembling it with the precision of a man who had forgotten how to sleep or how to stop preparing for the next fight. Each piece he wiped down with a cloth, his movements methodical, almost meditative, as though the act of cleaning the weapon could scrub the weight of memory from his shoulders. Sarah's gaze followed him, tracing the lines of his weariness. She wondered what ghosts clung to him, what shadows he'd buried in this hollowed-out sanctuary. When dawn came, it seeped through the cracks in the cabin walls like a hesitant guest, painting the floorboards in pale gold. Sarah stirred, her body aching as if stitched together by frayed thread, and froze when she saw it. A cradle beside the cot, rough and handmade, its splintered plank still bearing the marks of hurried craftsmanship. It rocked gently in the still air, empty but waiting, as though it had always belonged there. Her breath caught. How long had he worked on it? When had he found the time, between tending the fire and guarding the door and watching her with those unreadable eyes? The twins fussed, their cries sharpening, and Micah looked up from the stove where he'd been slicing potatoes. He nodded once at the cradle, his expression guarded. Thought they'd need something, he muttered, turning back to his task. Sarah didn't speak. She reached out, her fingers brushing the uneven wood, feeling the question carved into every splintered plank. Why save us? Why risk the past to make room for strangers? Outside, the wind carried the distant cry of a hawk, and the prairie stretched endless beneath the rising sun. Inside, the fire crackled, the stew simmered, and the cradle swayed, a fragile promise in a world that had taught Sarah to expect nothing. Micah didn't look at her, but his shoulders seemed to ease, just slightly, as if the act of building something new had loosened the grip of whatever he'd lost. The twins quieted, their breaths softening into sleep, and Sarah pressed her face to the cradle's edge, her tears falling silent and hot. For the first time in years, the weight in her chest wasn't fear. It was something else, something raw and tender and terrifyingly close to hope. Winter buried the cabin in white, its relentless snowdrifts swallowing the hills and muffling every sound until even the creak of the floorboards felt intrusive. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of simmering stew, a pot that had bubbled for hours, its contents a medley of root vegetables, dried herbs, and the last cuts of venison Micah had smoked months ago. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows that danced across the walls like ghosts of memories neither dared to name. Sarah sat at the rough-hewn table, her hands wrapped around a chipped tin mug of goat's milk. her gaze fixed on Micah as he stirred the stew with deliberate, circular motions. His back was to her, his posture rigid, the rifle he always kept within reach propped against the wall nearby. The twins, swaddled in a patchwork of blankets, lay in the cradle he'd built, their tiny fists batting at each other in sleepy contentment. The silence had grown so familiar, so comfortable, that when Micah finally spoke, his voice felt like a blade slicing through the stillness. "My wife, my boy, fever." The words hung in the air, raw and unadorned, as if he'd wrestled them free from some buried place. Sarah's throat tightened, her fingers tightening around the mug until her knuckles turned white. She hadn't asked him about his past. Not directly, but the question had lingered in every glance, every quiet act of kindness that felt too deliberate to be accidental. Now, as he turned to face her, his eyes were hollowed-out craters. The storm clouds she'd always seen there darkened by something older, heavier. Her own husband's face flickered in her mind, a man whose hands had been quick to strike, whose voice had cracked like a whip when she dared to speak out of turn. She remembered the night he'd thrown her against the hearth, her cheeks splitting on the stone edge, and the way his mother had watched, arms crossed, as if approving. She remembered the coffin, too shallow and too small, the way his family had buried him without a eulogy, only muttered grievances about the debt he'd left behind. The memory clawed at her chest, sharp and acidic, but before she could retreat into it, Micah's voice pulled her back. "They were gone in a week," he said, his voice low, almost conversational, as if he were recounting the weather rather than the deaths that had hollowed him out. "One day they were here, the next fever took them. I was gone, trapping. By the time I came back, they were already cold." He set the ladle down too forcefully, the clatter making the twins stir. Sarah's breath caught, her heart pounding as she watched him rub a hand over his face, the beard there graying at the edges. "You ever feel like grief starts to feel like company?" he asked, not looking at her. Sarah didn't answer right away. She thought of the Cranes, of the way they'd watched her suffer through labor, their eyes calculating the worth of her survival. She thought of Hannah, the midwife who'd risked everything to save her, and the fire that had roared behind her as she fled into the storm. Her throat burned with the weight of her own story, the one she'd written down and tucked beneath her pillow, the one she'd yet to share, even with Micah. But before she could speak, Rosie let out a sudden, high-pitched giggle, her tiny hands batting at Nora's face. The sound was bright, almost violent in its joy, and it snapped the tension like a thread. Micah's shoulders eased slightly, his gaze softening as he looked at the girls. "They're lucky," he murmured, his voice quieter now, almost reverent. "No ghost clinging to them yet." Sarah's chest ached, the words striking a chord she couldn't name. She wanted to ask him what he meant, to press him for more, but the moment felt fragile, like ice cracking underfoot. Instead, she reached out, her hand hovering near his before she let it fall to the table, her fingers brushing his once, twice. It was a small gesture, tentative and uncertain, but Micah didn't pull away. Was this healing? Sarah wondered, her pulse racing as she studied his face. Or was it another trap, another illusion of safety designed to lull her into complacency? Her mind spiraled back to the Cranes, to the way Silas's eyes had narrowed as he calculated her worth, to the fire that had licked at her heels as she fled. She had spent so long expecting betrayal that trust felt foreign, almost dangerous. And yet, here was Micah, a man who had built a cradle for her daughters without asking for anything in return, who had fed her and sheltered her without demanding her story. The stew bubbled louder, the scent of thyme and broth filling the cabin as the fire cast its amber glow over them. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, for the first time in years, Sarah felt something shift. Not quite hope, but the faintest glimmer of it, flickering like a candle in the dark. Micah's hand covered hers briefly, his callous palm rough against her skin. before he pulled away to ladle stew into 2 bowls. "Eat," he said, sliding one toward her. "You'll need your strength." Sarah stared at the bowl, steam rising in delicate tendrils, and wondered if strength was enough, or if survival required something more. A leap of faith, a gamble on the possibility that not all kindness was a lie. She picked up her spoon, the metal cool against her fingers, and took the first bite. The warmth spread through her chest, slow and steady, as the twins gurgled softly in the cradle. For now, this was enough. For now, she would let herself believe. Spring thawed the soil, but not the fear coiled tight in Sarah's chest. The prairie, once buried under winter's white grip, now squelched beneath the boots of 3 riders cresting the hill at dawn. Their shadows stretched like nooses across the muddy trail, elongated by the pale light filtering through a sky still bruised with morning clouds. The lead rider reined in his horse first, its hooves skidding slightly on the frost-softened earth. Sheriff Tate, lean and clean-shaven, tipped his hat with a gloved hand, his pale eyes sharp as flint beneath the brim. Behind him, 2 men lingered, Silas Crane's cousin, Jasper Rudd, and a stocky figure Sarah didn't recognize, though the Crane brand on his saddle told her all she needed to know. Sarah stood on the porch, her knuckles white against the wood rail as the sheriff's gaze snagged on the cradle visible through the open cabin door. The girls were inside, swaddled and sleeping, their tiny fists curled like buds waiting to bloom. Micah's rifle, propped in the corner near the hearth, felt miles away. The sheriff dismounted slowly, his boots crunching through the slushy mud as he approached. "Afternoon, ma'am," he drawled, though the sun had barely cleared the horizon. His voice was polite, almost deferential, but the lie in it scraped like gravel. "Name's Sheriff Tate, out of Harrow Creek. Got a matter of inquiry." Sarah's pulse roared in her ears. She'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. How to stand tall, how to speak without trembling. But now her throat tightened, her tongue heavy. "I'm not from there," she said, the words thin and brittle. The sheriff's smile didn't reach his eyes. "No, I reckon you're not." He glanced past her again, his gaze lingering on the cradle. "Mind if I step in a moment?" "I do mind," Sarah snapped, firmer this time. Her spine pressed against the doorframe, anchoring her. The sheriff paused, then nodded. "Fair enough." He reached into his coat, producing a folded paper Sarah knew contained lies. "A woman disappeared from a homestead west of here some months back. Name of Sarah Jane Crane. Widow. 2 infant daughters. Some say she ran. Some say she stole." His voice was smooth, practiced, but Sarah heard the blade beneath it. Her jaw clenched. "And if the truth is she ran because she feared for her life?" The sheriff raised a brow, his expression unreadable. Behind her, one of the girls stirred, a soft whimper cutting through the silence. Tate tilted his head, as if weighing options, then mounted his horse with deliberate ease. "I'll return with my superior," he said, tipping his hat again. "Sheriff, want to ask a few things direct." Sarah didn't watch him ride off. She shut the door, her legs trembling, and slid to the floor, her back pressed to the wood as if it could hold the world at bay. That night, while the twins slept in the cradle Micah had built, Sarah wrote her story. The ink bled through the paper as her hand shook, each word a shard of the past she'd buried. She wrote of the fire Silas had set, of Hannah's whispered warning, of the Crane family's contempt, a lie that had nearly swallowed her whole. Her pen hovered over the page as she recounted the night she'd fled, the smoke clawing at her heels, the twins' breath shallow against her chest. She wrote of Micah, the widower who'd carried her through the storm, and the fragile hope she'd dared to nurture in his cabin. When she finished, she folded the paper twice and tucked it beneath her pillow, her tears smudging the ink. Would the truth be enough to stop the storm? The question gnawed at her as the wind howled outside, rattling the window panes. Micah sat across from her, cleaning his rifle with the precision of a man who'd long since made peace with violence. "They'll come back," he said, not looking up. "And next time, it won't just be words." Sarah met his eyes, her fear sharp as broken glass. "You could get dragged into it." Micah set the rifle aside and crossed the room, his hands finding her shoulders, grounding her. "I already am," he said simply. Outside, the riders' tracks vanished into the mud, but the weight of their presence lingered. Somewhere beyond the hills, the cranes plotted, their lies sharpened like scythes. Inside, the cradle rocked gently, the twins' breaths syncing with the rhythm of the fire. Sarah pressed her face to Micah's chest, inhaling the scent of pine and leather, and whispered a prayer she hadn't dared in years. Let them see we're not prey. The storm had not yet broken, but when it did, she would be ready. Harrow Creek's church loomed like a tomb, its steeple jagged against the overcast sky, casting a long shadow over the dusty square where townsfolk gathered like crows on a fence. The pews inside groaned under the weight of murmuring bodies, their eyes flicking between Sarah and the crane matron seated stiff-backed in the front row. Agatha's black mourning dress seemed to swallow the light, her lips pressed into a line so thin it vanished entirely as Sarah stepped forward. The twins clutched her chest like talismans. The air smelled of polished wood and judgment, the faint scent of beeswax candles doing little to mask the acrid tension. Agatha's voice dripped poison, each word deliberate, honed by months of rehearsed venom. "She stole from us," she declared, her gloved hands tightening in her lap. "Set fire to our barn. Took what wasn't hers and left us nothing but shame." A ripple of gasps spread through the crowd, some leaning forward, others exchanging furtive glances. Sarah's throat burned, but she held her ground, her fingers brushing the soft curls of Rosie and Nora, as if their warmth could steady her. "I fled because they tried to kill me," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "The fire was meant for my grave. Ask Hannah Morse, she saw it. She heard your whispers." The doors at the back of the church creaked open, and all heads turned. Hannah Morse strode in, her shoulders squared, her dark eyes blazing with quiet fury. The crowd parted instinctively, the hush that followed thicker than the dust motes swirling in the pale light. She moved to the front with the gravity of someone carrying truth too heavy to hide. Her testimony came like a tidal wave. How she'd overheard Silas and Agatha plotting in the barn, how she'd returned to the homestead that night, not for a forgotten shawl, but to save Sarah from the flames they'd prepared for her. "I heard them say, 'Let her bleed out,'" Hannah said, her voice unwavering, "and I knew I couldn't let silence be my witness." The judge, a gaunt woman with gray hair coiled like a crown of thorns, rapped her gavel once, the sound sharp as a rifle shot. "This court finds no grounds for charge," she intoned, her gravel-soaked voice heavy with finality. "Miss Sarah Jane is cleared of all accusation and is free under the law to pursue any life she sees fit." The words hung in the air, but there was no cheer, only a stunned silence. Agatha did not glance at Sarah as she rose, her skirts rustling like dead leaves. Silas lingered a moment longer, his jaw clenched so tightly it trembled, shame etching hollows into his face before he turned away. Outside, the sun hung low, its golden light doing little to warm the chill in Sarah's bones. Micah stood by the wagon, his hand resting near the rifle strapped to his side, his eyes scanning the horizon where shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. The journey home felt heavier than the trip to town, the wheels creaking over familiar soil as the girls dozed in the basket between them. Harrow Creek faded behind them, but the weight of its gaze lingered, a reminder that freedom was not a destination but a fragile thread. That night, as the fire crackled in the hearth and the twins slept in their cradle, Micah checked the door latches twice, his rifle never far from reach. Sarah traced the scars on her belly, now symbols of survival. and wondered if the Cranes would let the verdict stand, or if their hatred would find another way to burn her down. Fall leaves blazed gold as Micah slid a birchwood ring onto Sarah's finger, the pale wood catching the last light of dusk like a promise etched in flame. The ceremony had been simple. A handful of borrowed chairs beneath the gnarled apple tree that stood at the edge of the cabin's clearing, its branches heavy with fruit that glowed like lanterns in the fading light. Hannah sat in the back row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. She had not been sure she'd live to see this day. Not after the fire, not after the whispers of the Crane's vengeance. But here they were, Sarah, radiant in a dress she'd stitched herself, the twins giggling at her feet. Micah, steady and sure, his callous thumb brushing the ring into place. The girls, Rosie and Nora, had grown into whirlwinds of motion, their legs strong enough now to chase moths darting through the grass, their laughter weaving through the crisp autumn air like music. Rosie, ever the bold one, lunged for a fluttering shadow, while Nora lagged behind, her small hands clutching a fallen apple she refused to let go of, its skin polished to a shine by her grip. That night, as the fire crackled in the hearth and the scent of roasted venison lingered in the cabin, Sarah traced the scars on her belly, her fingers moving reverently over the ridges of healed flesh. They were no longer wounds, but maps of survival, each ridge and curve a testament to the night she had clawed her way out of the fire's path. Micah's arms wrapped around her from behind, his breath warm against her neck as he pressed a kiss to the hollow of her throat. "You're trembling," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. She nodded, her throat tight. "I keep expecting to wake up back there," she whispered, in the dark, with them plotting. Micah's grip tightened, steady and grounding. "You're here," he said simply. "With me. With them." He gestured toward the cradle where the girls slept, their cheeks flushed pink, their tiny fists curled like buds. Outside, the prairie stretched endless, the horizon a smudge of gold and indigo where the sun had just vanished. The wind carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, mingling with the faint sweetness of apples rotting in the grass. Sarah pressed her forehead to the window pane, her breath fogging the glass. She thought of the Crane homestead, now a distant memory buried beneath seasons of snow and rain. She wondered if Silas still nursed a shame, if Agatha still muttered curses into her shawl. But the past felt smaller now, like a shadow, shrinking as the sun rises. The fire had tried to consume her. Its heat had singed her hair, its smoke had scorched her lungs. But Sarah had learned to bloom in ashes. She had planted herself in this soil, stubborn and wild, and the roots ran deep. Micah's hand found hers, his palm rough against her knuckles. "You're thinking too loud," he teased, his lips quirking into a half-smile. Sarah laughed softly, the sound unfamiliar yet welcome. "Just remembering," she said. He nodded, his gaze drifting to the apple tree outside, its branches swaying like an old woman rocking to sleep. "That tree seemed more than most," he said. "It watched you stumble here half dead. Watched me dig, graze alone. Now it's got rings for every season we've survived together." Sarah leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. "Maybe it'll see us old someday," she said, her voice wistful. Gray-haired and creaky, still arguing over who left the axe by the door. Micah chuckled, the sound low and warm. "You'd win, of course. You always do." The twins stirred in their cradle, their whimpers soft as moth wings. Sarah moved to them, her steps sure and unhurried, her body no longer coiled for flight. She lifted Rosie first, the baby's eyes fluttering open to fix on her mother's face with a gaze as sharp and curious as Micah's. Nora followed, her tiny fingers grasping at Sarah's braid. "Look at you," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with wonder. "You've never known fear, just love." She kissed their foreheads, their warmth seeping in her chest, and thought of Hannah's words the night she'd fled. You got strength in you more than most. She had doubted it then. Her spirit as frayed as the hem of her dress. But now she wore strength like a second skin, stitched into her by every step she'd taken, every choice she'd made. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of rose and amber, Sarah stood at the edge of the clearing, the twins balanced on her hips. The apple tree's shadow stretched long behind her, a silent sentinel. Micah worked nearby, splitting logs with rhythmic precision, the axe biting deep into the stump. The girls babbled at the sound, their laughter bright and unburdened. Sarah watched him for a moment, her heart full of the ordinary magic of this life. The way his brow furrowed in concentration, the way he paused to wipe sweat from his brow, the way he glanced up and caught her staring, his eyes softening into something that felt like a vow. The fire had tried to consume her, yes. But Sarah had not merely survived. She had thrived, her love for her daughters, and Micah rooting her in a way she'd never imagined possible. The scars on her belly were no longer reminders of pain, but proof of her unyielding will to live. And as the wind carried the scent of apples and earth, she whispered a prayer to the tree, to the land, to the universe itself. Let this be enough. Let this be everything. The prairie stretched endless before her. But here, in this quiet, forgotten place, Sarah had found her forever. And forever, she decided, was not a destination, but a series of moments like this, golden, fleeting, and fiercely held.